Hello there.
Hello, this live from California, yes?
Indeed.
Oh, there you are. Hello, nice to see you. Welcome. Welcome virtually. Everybody, this is Emma Stewart, who is the inaugural, I was going to say the first, but inaugural is a better word, sustainability officer at Netflix, where she has two facets to her role. One is actually wrangling Netflix's own emissions down to net zero by 2022. Is that right? Did I read that right, Emma?
That is not a typo.
Right. Well, there's a question right there. Okay. And then the second half is the kind of the raising of the awareness of climate change with your subscribers and through your content, which is why it's great to have you here. Emma's clearly based in California, and before Netflix has been kind of around in this environmental space for a while, including WRI, which many of us know, a PhD in environmental science from Stanford. And I think before I kind of hand to you, Emma, we've already seen it on slides here. I don't know if you've been able to follow us. You've probably just got out of bed, but Don't Look Up has had an impact. Yeah, there's something in that, the creative writing around that and the way it's kind of portrayed our denial of climate change, that's really affected people, and it's kind of it was a kind of an aha moment for a lot of people. And that was Netflix, wasn't it? So I hope you're going to mention that.
I planned on it.
Brilliant. In that case, you're in the right place, and I'm very glad you joined us. So Emma, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through it. So the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I was actually in London last week, so I'm very sorry that the timing didn't work out for me to be there in person. I believe Rob is going to pull up some slides for me. There we go. And the introduction was so thorough, I'm actually going to skip my first slide and jump right into how we're doing this work. So if we flip to the next slide, I was hired very late as the first sustainability professional to Netflix, October 2020. So I'm actually just coming up on my second work year anniversary. And what we decided to do, flip back to the previous slide, was to set up a sustainability advisory group. I was asked to bring a real scientific lens to this work, but I like to argue that science is not purely the hard sciences, but also the natural sciences and the behavioral sciences. And you'll see here that reflected in our advisory group, which some have called the Climate Avengers. It is an incredibly illustrious group of scientists, policymakers, and storytellers. So really using all parts of the brain. On the next slide, you'll see 10 of the principles that we set up to guide ourselves as we did this work. I'll call out just a few of them because you can read the others. One is to move fast, but ground everything in science. So as I said, the company got a late start to this, in large part because of our culture of freedom and responsibility, meaning that most decisions are driven locally and in a decentralized fashion. So the idea of having a centralized hub for sustainability was somewhat anathema to the corporate culture that has served the company so well. But at some point it was determined by our executive team that having in-house depth of expertise and leadership was a necessity. So that moving fast was in part to catch up with our peers and with our industry. But again, we really wanted to ground everything in science, including the support services I'll mention in a moment that serve our creative executives and our storytellers. Another thing we try to do is focus on what matters as opposed to what is most visible. One of the things that I found in stepping into this sector is that there's a fascination with plastic water bottles on set, which unfortunately is really not even the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the environmental footprint of production. That really largely centers around fuel and electricity use. There are many diesel generators in the making of a film, also many fleets of trucks running half empty. And so there's a lot of opportunity to clean up waste and to decarbonize those fuels and that electricity. We also want to prioritize scalability over novelty. We're essentially looking to be copied. If we do something right, we want our peers and our competitors to learn from it and to benefit from it. After all, we all share the same ecosystem and the same supply chains. Next slide. So one of the beauties of this job, as I mentioned, is that I get to remain steeped in the science, but also spend time with creators and with filmmakers in order to continue to entertain the 200 million or so households around the world that we hope continue to enjoy Netflix. In fact, Peter Kariva, some of you may know, was a famous conservation scientist. He has a quote I absolutely love, which is, "Science tells us what to do, while storytelling makes us want to do it." So you need both. And I think in many ways, the climate field and the sustainability field where I come from has failed to really recognize the importance of narrative and emotion, and instead has brought charts and graphs, which is how I was trained, which we've learned really just don't galvanize much action. What we have found is that even just as a baseline analysis that we did back in 2020, a majority of our consumers, so 160 million households around the world, have chosen to watch at least one story on Netflix that is explicitly about sustainability, so a very conservative kind of sampling. And of course, many, many more have watched those that touch on it or that make reference to it. Some of our findings also are that consumers would like to see more of this. A 16-country study found that 2/3 of people would like to see more climate stories and issues on screen and in every genre. Next slide. I'm glad that Don't Look Up has already been mentioned. It ignited just a massive conversation in the press and online. It was a satire about the cautionary tale that is climate inaction. And those of us who were trained as scientists really felt seen. I heard from many climate scientists. They came out of the woodwork online. Many of them don't typically weigh in on a film, but they were saying it was really quite cathartic to see this chronicle on screen of how scientific consensus was often being portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence and either laughed at, politicized, or ignored. But the climate scientists weren't the only ones who reacted to this film. It broke multiple records for viewership at Netflix. It became the second most popular film ever in our company's history. And it was the first comedy to hit the top 10 in 90 different countries. Comedies often don't travel as well as other genres for obvious reasons of cultural differences. And what we found was that the tail of conversation lasted a lot longer than for other films. And we even started to see the climate movement pick up some of the slogans. I heard just yesterday a New York Times summit talking about how we should all just look up. We saw marches by tens of thousands of people through the streets of France chanting, "Just look up." If any of us could sing as well as Ariana Grande, I think her song might have become a bit of an anthem for the movement. And this is perhaps not surprising if you've looked at the global public opinion polls recently. A majority of people around the world, but in particular in middle income and lower income countries, consider themselves alarmed or concerned about climate change and consider it very important to them personally. So what this film did was tap into a societal zeitgeist at the right moment. And what we did on the next slide is we worked with the filmmakers to usher those who had been moved by the film into an environment online where they could take science-backed action and become part of a community that was doing the same. So this concept in behavioral science of collective efficacy is very important, that you feel like you are part of a movement of others doing like-minded things is essential to people continuing to take action. And we worked with Project Drawdown, which was just mentioned. We commissioned research by them that it turns out had never been done to figure out what are the top 20 actions that can be taken by a household or an individual that have the highest climate impact. And we took those steps and then we coupled them with steps that households and individuals can take to change the system around them. Because of course, no one wants to imply that this is a challenge that the individual should solve. And so those additional steps were things like spark ideas at work. So encourage your employer to think about setting their own targets, make your money count if you're lucky enough to be an investor, but even with your bank account or your pension fund. and keep politicians accountable and be sure to vote. So this platform was built in partnership with a nonprofit out of the UK called Count Us In. And then, as I mentioned, coupling research from Project Drawdown, from Nielsen, from NG, and then the behavioral science messaging from RARE. And we've started to use this same backbone and the math behind it for other titles. So our Great National Parks with Barack Obama just came out recently. And similarly, we reskinned this climate action website and tailored it more appropriately to that set of nature documentary stories. But ultimately, the actions underneath that we're encouraging people to take are all based upon this list of the top most impactful actions. Next slide. In April of this year, we put out the first sustainability collection at Netflix. We curated about 170 different stories from every genre. And then we coupled it with a marketing campaign that really shone a spotlight on these stories and encouraged people to consider them. These were a combination of perhaps the predictable types of titles like nature documentaries or explanatory documentaries, but also thrillers like Ragnarok or Green Frontier, Frontera Verde out of Latin America, the sci-fi I.O., Last on Earth, and titles like The Minimalists that talk about consumerism and some of the psychological downsides of over-consumerism. And then really fun, accessible, family-friendly titles like Penguin Town, which is hilarious if you haven't seen it, Izzy's Koala World, which is my children's favorite, and Bigfoot Family. Now, some of these titles, as you'll see on this slide, have a very explicit green premise. A good recent example of that is The Sea Beast. So Sea Beast is a animated film. It actually is now our most popular animated film ever. And it tells the story of a young heroine who defends a misunderstood and maligned sea monster from hunters who have been paid by, it turns out, a corrupt royal family. And so it starts to sound very familiar to those of you who have watched the vilification of marine creatures like sharks that appear dangerous, but in fact are largely not. And it inspires audiences to protect the world's real sea beasts. And we actually worked with the marketing team to run a campaign to protect the real sea beasts of the world. Some of you might have seen The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, a Malawian story, really incredibly heartwarming, a young, heroic inventor who brings clean electricity to his drought-stricken community. And this film portrays both the impacts of climate change on the developing world, as well as the entrepreneurialism that is local, that can help pull them out of that crisis. My Octopus Teacher hopefully is familiar to many of you. This Academy Award-winning documentary tells the story of a burnt-out naturalist who forges an unlikely bond, some say love affair, with an octopus. And the heartwarming nature of their devotion to one another is really contextualized in this magical underwater world that the South Africans call the sea forest. And now we've seen actually quite a few moves to protect sea forests, what are kelp forests around the world, as well as changes in policy locally in South Africa, inspired by the film. I'll move on to the next slide just to give you a sense of another form of impact. One title in particular, Breaking Boundaries, while perhaps not reaching the most viewers in terms of the mass audience, seemed to have a really disproportionate impact on policymakers. President Joe Biden and Secretary John Kerry personally requested that it be shown at Biden's Climate Leaders Summit to 40 heads of state. We're told that a number of those heads of state then went home to their cabinets and asked their cabinets to watch the film. It was also shown at the Nobel Summit as well as the G7. And so this film chronicles the life's work of Dr. Johan Rockström, someone we are very privileged to have also on our advisory group, who talks about the 9 planetary thresholds and where we are vis-a-vis passing them and keeping life on Earth in the safety zone. so below 1.5 degrees Celsius, ideally, and the need to restore at least a third of natural ecosystems on land. So he and David Attenborough paired up two of the best scientific communicators one can think of and made this film together. On the next slide, I'll just give you a sampling of examples of how climate impacts and solutions, as they become an integral and natural part of our lives, they become, perhaps not surprisingly, more integrated into storytelling. And that can happen both overtly, but also more subtly. So you can do a little bit of a scavenger hunt and watch these films and tell us whether you have subliminally or perhaps consciously noticed some of the ways that story this new reality into the. You see meaningful actions in popular series like Lupin, like Grace and Frankie, like Sweet Magnolias out of the south of the United States. You also see climate realities about misinformation exposed in documentaries like The Social Dilemma. You have green subplots and characters with sustainability professions in popular shows like Falling in Love, which is a rom-com, Sweet Tooth, which of course is a fantasy, and even the horror title Midnight Mass, which I still, to be honest, don't have the courage to watch myself. And then Queer Eye, Atypical, Ginny and Georgia, these all shed a light on how Gen Zers are growing deeply anxious over the state of the planet that they're being handed. Lastly, Red Notice was a hugely popular film for Netflix, and you will perhaps have seen that The Rock, when he gets into his car chase, is driving one of the coolest electric vehicles that you'll ever see on screen. So as we seek to entertain the world, there needs to be something for everyone. And this is a sampling of the 200 or so stories on the service. On the next slide, you'll see some of the ones that are coming out or have just come out. We have Stories of a Generation with Pope Francis, which talks a lot about his devotion to this topic and his relationship with Dame Jane Goodall. You have The End of Oil Explained, which is an expose series, and The Future Of, which is a fun documentary series about the future of buildings and skyscrapers, the meat industry, among other topics. And then we have additional seasons coming up for Down to Earth, for Ada Twist Scientist by Michelle Obama, Virgin River, which is fun in that it has a real penchant for low carbon technologies in the making of that popular series. I mentioned Sweet Magnolias, new season of that coming up, as well as Ragnarok out of the Nordics. So this final slide is just some testimonials I'll leave you with from our incredible advisory group, which includes Christiana Figueres, of course, the woman who is credited with having successfully struck the Paris Agreement, Shea Bastida, who is a young climate activist. She also spoke at Biden's Leaders Climate Summit and has won the Spirit of the UN Award. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, an atmospheric scientist out of Texas, a Canadian who also serves as the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and Dr. Johan Rockström, who I mentioned, from the Potsdam Institute. And then just because it wouldn't be appropriate otherwise, I brought a small short film for you all that I'm hoping that Rob can help me play. And to tee this up, this is just examples, as I've done verbally, but in a film form, of the ways in which sustainability is already showing up on screen at Netflix, and hopefully with the support services and the interest from our creators, the ways in which we can support them in doing so in hugely entertaining, authentic, and accurate ways.
Don't go away. We'll come back to you, Rob.
We need to define what society means.
AI won't kill us before climate change.
Some people say it's the most dangerous animal out here, but it's not.
What is?
We are.
It starts with votes like this one. It starts with you.
Now go.
I'm
ready to blow minds with affordable 100% solar-powered green housing.
Okay, my mind is actually blown.
You have a yam man.
My friend Jacob, he's an organic grower and one of my top 12 favorite people.
Are you like a scientist?
Yes, 99.78% to be exact.
Oh, great. Okay, so it's not 100%.
Call it 70% and let's move on.
We did everything we could. We brought our own bags.
I saw a kid litter, and I started crying because
Nobody cares about the planet.
Always try to leave things better than I found them.
How about we ban plastic from the state of California?
You are the solution.
Wow, this is so cool.
Si vous roulez pas là, coupez le moteur.
Oui, bien sûr.
Bah, faut penser à la planète un petit peu.
Thank you, Emma. I think Are you okay to stay on the line and take a few questions? Do you have the time?
Yes, yes.
Great. Well, I will exercise the chair's prerogative and start with a couple. The first one I wanted to ask you was, you had two bits to your role, and you've done a fantastic job of giving us an overview of kind of sustainability in content. You also have the internal job of sustainability in Netflix, and I don't want to kind of go too far into the detail of that, but how do the two halves talk to each other? So when you're kind of, you've got to persuade colleagues, do you find that you're kind of talking to a producer who is all up for the story, but not up for the behavioural change required in the way that they're making the programme? How do the two parts of the role go together?
What a wonderful question. Generally speaking, we find that if they're up for one, they're up for the other. But your question is particularly astute because there, like in every field, is a lot of specialization. And so one of my team members might be talking to the physical production side of a series or film, but it might be that my other team is not aware of ways in which they could support the writer's room. So we do try and act as glue in that respect and bring the two together. The best case scenarios, of course, are when we're able to support the creative team and the production team, so behind the camera and in front of the camera. In terms of the work that we're doing to decarbonize the company, not surprisingly, for an entertainment company, most of our emissions come from the making of film and television, about 60% of our carbon footprint, which itself is 1.5 million metric tons in the latest year. And so that's really our focus, in particular around fuel and electricity use in production. And then we also look at sustainable aviation fuel, at energy efficiency and the behavioral changes to squeeze out energy waste. And vehicle electrification has been a particular area of interest because that's where we think one of our biggest levers is to first optimize our use of fleets. All of this is rented or leased. We don't own any fleets or equipment. And then to ultimately electrify those fleets and that equipment, and then to decarbonize whatever's left. So we use that rubric of optimize, electrify, decarbonize across our business.
Thank you. Great answer. Time for questions in the room. Same again, you're going to need the microphone so Emma can hear you. Question over there, if Rob, you can provide the mic. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. It was just on how kind of granular do you guys go in terms of like casting, for example? Do you have more of a preference with working with talent that I guess are more active in the climate space?
We really leave that to our creators to make decisions about casting. We do provide research and resources. So for example, Variety has now a database of 2,000 members of talent, mostly on-screen talent, that looks at their interest in climate on 3 different dimensions. 1, in their personal lives, 2, in their advocacy, so how they're using their voice and their celebrity, and then 3, in their craft. So projects that they've done that have focused on sustainability topics. And that database has proven to be of great interest to our casting teams and to a number of our creative executives, as well as our marketing teams.
Is that something that you share, or is that just internal, like private?
Oh, you should ask Variety. It's Variety's data, so
oh, okay.
I can't speak for them.
Sounds pretty explosive, it has to be said, but yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Another question in the room? Yep, one over here. Finney, thank you.
Thank you. In terms of documentaries where you're kind of filming all over the globe, how do you look to decarbonise that in terms of, you know, travelling by air, and also where you're filming? Do you kind of choose that, or is that left to the creative people, or do you have a say in that as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so wherever possible, we use local crews and grow the pipeline locally. That, of course, has the benefit of generating jobs and the creative economy in a given country, in addition to eliminating unnecessary air travel. But as you rightly point out, it's almost impossible to film a nature documentary without getting on a plane at some point. So one of the things that we've done is co-founded with a number of other companies something called the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, SABA for short. And this group, together with a number of environmental NGOs to ensure the integrity of the work, is accomplishing 2 things. One, developing what's called a book and claim system, meaning a credit system for sustainable aviation fuel in the near term. And then in the long term, creating a market signal that will dramatically increase the supply of sustainable aviation fuel. Most people have never even heard of sustainable aviation fuel. It is a drop-in fuel, so it requires no retrofit to the engine. The pilots might not even know that there's sustainable aviation fuel in their jets, but it is about 80% lower carbon from a life cycle standpoint. So it's a very promising fuel that unfortunately is just not available in most places and still has a pretty sizable premium. So we ourselves are paying that premium for the tiny fleet of very small commuter shuttles that we offer to our employees between Los Angeles and Los Gatos here in California. But we are also, through this SABA group, signaling to producers that we are willing to pay the premium and that they need to be focused on increasing the supply of SAF as this lower carbon alternative. In addition, we purchase high quality carbon credits that cover all productions that are ultimately branded as Netflix on the service. And that includes what are called partner managed or licensed titles that we buy. So in other words, the air travel, as well as all the other activities of a Netflix production, are carbon neutral, in addition to the work that we're doing to decarbonize the productions that we manage.
Thanks, Emma. I'm going to go for one last question in the room, I'm afraid, and I'm going to go for the gentleman in the green. Oh, wow. Suddenly we've got a late rush. All right, I'll try 3. Quick questions, quick answers. Here we go.
Hi, it's Adrian from the Climate Content Pledge. Emma, Netflix is about to start showing advertising. We had a great presentation earlier which said you can have all this brilliant climate content, but then it's undermined if you have sort of high carbon advertisers. For other broadcasters, it's a real challenge because they'd be giving up income. Netflix, it's all new income. Are you involved in sort of helping to make sure that the advertising doesn't undermine your messaging?
Great question. Brand new business. I think they've been around for about 3 months now. So the company is moving incredibly quickly to try and pilot the advertising tier. And we are in touch with that group to discuss precisely what you described, Adrian.
You might want to watch, Emma, if you get time, the recording of Jonathan's session or the slides of Jonathan's session from earlier on. Very interesting and a very useful tool there. Go on then, Denise, quick question, and then we'll go for the two at the back.
Hi, Emma. So thanks for a great presentation. I don't know if you saw the previous two presentations. So I run the Green Stories writing competitions, and Lauren runs the Climate Fiction Writers League. And we have access to tons and tons of really great stories that would make great series and films. You know, what would be a submission process for us to try and get some of them, you know, made?
So I can't guarantee anything and I can't accept pitches. However, since these are really pieces of literature, we are always on the lookout for good, entertaining, accurate, and enriching storytelling in whatever form, whether that's in book form or journalism, short stories, essays. So please, if you don't mind going through Carnstone, get in touch with us.
Great, thank you. We had two questions at the back, Rob, if you don't mind a bit of a sprint. Thank you.
Hi, Emma, it's Gabby from the BBC. Nice to see you, albeit virtually. Hi. I just wondered how you were doing in terms of educating and upskilling commissioners at Netflix and engaging them with this as a topic, and indeed your wider supply chain. It's a conversation certainly we're having in the UK about how we upskill a whole industry so that knowledge and passion doesn't sit with you and I and sustainability teams, but permeates the wider creative community.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of demand from both our creative executives and the professional storytellers they work with. So we act as an internal resource to support them making informed decisions about, for example, the behaviors they might want to show on screen, or brainstorming with them in the writer's room about plot twists, character arcs, settings, scenery, and ways in which even in fictional writing, this can show up and really portray either the future that we all want to see, a more just as well as verdant and stable climate, but also to ensure that what they're portraying, even in fiction, is accurate. So we get some really fun inquiries, and we try to be as responsive as possible. And when my team is perhaps not as deep on a particular topic, let's say regenerative agriculture, then we would bring in experts from our partners like the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Thanks, Emma. We have one last question. I saw there was one other hand somewhere near the back. Jennifer.
Hi. I was wondering about Netflix's net zero commitment and to be net zero with net zero emissions by the end of 2022. And how that aligns with now the new SBTI net zero standard.
Thank you. I said that was
a question. So we have two public climate targets. One is to have our emissions by 2030. So that's a validated third-party science-based target. And then the net zero target that we put out a year and a half ago preceded any standards. So it's been very difficult for companies with near-term targets to navigate a world without standards. There now is one, though we understand that that's being revisited from SBTI. And there's a whole host of others that are in the works, some of which will be coming out as soon as COP. So it's still very early days in the standards world. So what we use as our touchstone is the science. We are going directly from the IPCC reports, among others, like the National Academy of Sciences. And what those say very clearly is that this decade is the most critical, quote unquote. And so what that means to us is immediate action is more valuable than action in the 2030s or 2040s. So that's why we hold ourselves to this very high bar of both decarbonizing our company in line with climate science, and on top of that, for any remaining emissions in a given year, starting this year, to compensate with high quality carbon credits.
Thank you. We really must bring it to an end there. But Emma, thank you very much for sharing your time with us this morning. We wish you a very good Thursday ahead. We've already done Thursday. It was great. So I hope yours is as good as ours. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.